Okay, so we have set up, the situation where you're looking at the PowerPoint, and you should have this on Canvas. Just seems easier to do it this way. If I throw the monitor up there, put the camera on that, then it saves you having to look at me. But we'll try to follow along with the PowerPoint. I'm using the NOVA resource, and this is pretty much the same material that's covered in Griggs Chapter 3. This presentation just works a little bit better for us. So what we're covering is sensation and perception. We just finished looking at the brain. Now we're looking at sensation and perception. So what I want to do here is just to cover the basic concepts for a few moments, and we'll probably tackle this in at least a couple of videos. So again, sensation, perception, just the basic concepts we're trying to lay out today. So this lecture, or this chapter really in its entirety, covers two of the most fundamental topics in all psychology, which would be sensation and perception. Really important to us because we sense, we feel so many different things. That's how we access the world around us. But then how do we draw conclusions from those senses? If you've ever thought about that, what's the difference between sensation and perception? So these are among the topics that really have the longest history in terms of research attention, dating back to the 1700s when the quote-unquote physicalists such as Weber and Helmholtz, these are Germans, first studied biological aspects of the nervous system and sensory organs. So let's just talk about sensation, perception, just in broad brush strokes for a second. So sensation is largely organized around the five senses. You know what they are. We'll mention them in a moment. But they emphasize the biological aspects of basic information processing. That's how we receive, right? That's how we receive, information. That is to say, how do we draw conclusions about things? How do we assess the environment around us or within us? So that's sensation. Perception, on the other hand, largely organized around using that information in effective ways. So how is it that you use the information? What do you do with all that? And we know that our minds, aren't in neutral, and we know that somehow we draw conclusions. We assess the world around us. Like the lecture dealing with the brain and the nervous system, if you remember that wild ride, this lecture can be a bit difficult just because of the sheer volume of new and often difficult vocabulary words. So if you read Griggs, for example, you'd see a whole bunch of new terms, and it really doesn't help us that so much of this is kind of anatomical in nature, biological, all those kinds of things that we think, well, shouldn't that be like a life science course or something like that, rather than like psychology. I thought psychology, we're just going to be studying how people think and reason and things of that nature. So you really don't want to hit the panic button when you see these difficult words. They're just words that are specific nomenclature, we might say, or words that are used. For example, so you take systematic theology, and to the average person who isn't a student of Bible doctrine or the Bible or theological studies, then to do systematic theology uses a lot of terms that are really way out there for the average person. But yet, if we were to mention some of those, just like, for example, we said eschatology, and you would all easily know what that term means, but then a person outside the field wouldn't really understand the use of that term. So we just kind of have to kick the tires a little bit, get used to some of these terms, and we'll find that the more often you use the terms and use them in context, the easier it is to understand and become familiar with them. So just so your eyes don't glass over, let me change a slide. And so you'll see here an overview of really what we want to talk about, basic concepts. That's what we want to do today, or at least today, I say today, or whenever you view this. What do we want to cover in this section, in other words? So basic concepts. And the other things seem pretty simple, right? Vision, hearing, these are all just, the way that we use our senses then to perceive the world around us. So vision, hearing, touch, smell, taste, and this multimodal perception. Wow, I wonder what that is. So I'll click it back there for just a second. Now, sensation then, just to go back to this again and ask the question, well, what is sensation? Why should we care about sensation? Well, I'll tell you, you would know it if you didn't have it. You'd say, boy, I really care that I can taste something or not. I really care whether I can see or not, and hear or not, things of that nature. So sensation then is simply the physical processing of stimuli through the sensory organs and channels. Well, there you go, right? So textbook definition. But now we throw the word out there, stimuli. So there is a stimulus, right? So stimulus, stimuli being the plural, more than one. So stimulus, well, in physiology, it would be the detectable change in an organism's internal or external environment. So something inside of you, something outside of you changes, and that change then stimulates a response or is a stimulus, or more than one change coming at you, stimuli. And then through the sensory organs, whether it's your tongue that can taste, or your eye that can see, or your ears that can hear, and so on, right? These are, if you will, like channels, different channels that you receive information. And a lot of times all these channels, unlike your Netflix or your different apps, they aren't, hopefully not all firing at the same time. But sometimes with sensation, this can all happen at the same time. That's simply put, we see light, we hear sound, and our ability to respond. I know this is just really rudimentary and simple, but it bears saying. Our ability to respond then is called what? It's called sensitivity. And there's an emphasis then on the physical here, right? The physical here. Processing things as sensation is a mechanical process by which the sensory organs detect and process stimuli. We'll unpack that for a moment. Sensory organs then, these are all physical, right? Eyes, nose, ears, tongue, skin. These are the sensory organs that do what? Process stimuli, process light, sudden flash of light. How do you process that? A sudden sound, or just any sound, or what you taste when you eat, what you smell. No comment. How about just the heat and cold on your body? Your ability to sense that. So some of you may wonder, like why are we studying biological processes? You can say processes if you want, but humor me. Why would we be studying biological processes such as vision? Like why? What in the world would that have to do with psychology? So these topics can seem more at home in anatomy or biology courses. In fact, it was a number of botanists and physiologists who first began the systematic investigation into the human sensory organs. Like, for instance, if you go back to 1791, he's an Italian fellow here, I believe, because his name is Luigi Galvani. This is where whoever we might refer, get the term galvanic skin response, and who also partially inspired the novel Frankenstein, by the way. He used frogs to identify the flow of electrical activity through the muscles and nervous system. So don't try this one at home. But this was a seminal study for understanding the mechanical foundations of the link between mental and physical processes, such as thinking and moving. Well, 1830, Ernst Heinrich Weber, a physiologist, used knitting needles dipped in carbon powder to identify what we'll come to know in a little bit as JND, or just noticeable differences. And it refers to the 2 points closest together on the skin. I mean, in this case, we'll define it conceptually better in a moment. But in this particular case, using these knitting needles dipped in carbon powder, what are you trying to do? Identify the 2 points closest together on the skin that can still be distinguished from one another. And in so doing, he pioneered the field of human sensation or perception and research into the sense of touch. So the answer to your concerns regarding, why are we learning about biological processes, it's much the same as the answer as to why it's important for you to learn about the brain. So the mechanical, meaning really the physical here, physical underpinnings of psychological processes are necessary for us to understand how thinking and emotions work. So imagine trying to study eyewitness testimonies if you did not understand how eyes and vision worked. So just a little bit about the 5 senses. You know what they are, but people constantly track sensory stimuli such as the direction and speed of movement, or have their attention called by a sudden background noise. At a very fundamental level, we use our classic 5 senses: seeing or vision, hearing, or what we call audition, smelling, olfaction, tough for me to say, it's a strange word, we don't use it a lot. Olfaction refers to this sense of smell. Tasting, touching, to receive information about the world around us. Sure. So it's amazing that humans are specially equipped to take in stimuli, such as light or sound, and then transform these into electrical signals. Because, we do remember this from looking at the neurotransmitters and, all those crazy little tiny parts within the brain that basically communicate various moods to us in a sense through chemicals that are variously influenced within the brain, if you remember that whole discussion. So these electrical signals are then processed by the brain. So simply taking in the stimuli, taking it in, right, through the senses, we sense, and these are the channels. Remember, these are like the channels. That's the sensation. While processing it, understanding it, and using it then is, or I could say guides behavior, that's perception. So there is this kind of a distinction that we want to make between how we receive the information, then what we do with it, right? How we receive its sensation, what we do with it is perception. So it's kind of an interesting distinction there, especially to kind of take a couple steps back and take a look at it. So there are various ways to categorize senses. So first you can divide the 5 senses into distance senses, and contact senses. So the former, or the distance senses, including vision, hearing, and there's that word olfaction again. Olfaction, or a sense of smell, are the ability to sense at a distance, hence distance senses. For the latter, that is contact senses, taste and touch, a person must then be in contact with the stimuli for sensation to occur. So all that makes sense to us. It's pretty self-evident, we might say. But another categorization strategy is to then parse out, or by parsing we mean you take something apart, you divide it up so you can analyze it in smaller parts. But another categorization strategy then could be to parse out like smell and taste. What if we separated those out, smell and taste together, as chemical senses? So these two senses have specialized receptors that can convert environmental chemicals like tastants or like odorants, and convert them into electrical signals that can be processed by the brain. And it's also possible to break some senses into finer gradients. Like the sense of taste, for instance, is one overarching sense that includes more specific sensations. Like is that taste sweet? Is it bitter? Is it sour? Is it salty? And there's this what's called umami. Umami. Now there's another new term. It's like old-fashioned umami, but that refers to the savory stuff, like MSG, putting MSG in something, which is like a food additive. They put it in broths, gravies, soups, or sauces, things of this nature. So similarly, the sense of touch can be divided into sensitivity to pain, temperature, and texture. So finally, it's worth mentioning that the classic 5 senses are not the only senses. We also typically talk of the vestibular system, which is implicated in the sense of balance and ability to locate like how spatially aware are you? Are you always bumping into somebody or tripping over something? I'm not sure what that's all about, but this sort of refers to yet kind of another sense, what some people would call like a sixth sense or something. It's this idea that, hey, you can balance yourself somehow. You have some spatial awareness about you. You can locate yourself in a particular. You're conscious of being in a place, something like this. And then there's this idea of multimodal perception, and all this we'll come back to in the PowerPoint. I promise you, I will change that slide that you're looking at. Multimodal perception is perhaps the most overlooked aspect of sensation and perception, as it is typically taught in college courses. By necessity, we teach sensation parsed apart, like to analyze something by its parts. We parse it into the individual senses. So how's that? Like taste, touch, smell, sight, hearing. But when perception occurs, when we make sense of these sensory inputs, the perception is more than the sum of its constituent parts. Okay, for example, when you witness a minor car accident, you do not simply see the motion, hear the sound, and smell the odors of the accident. Instead, these sights, sounds, and smells combine to create a mental image of what happened. In the same way, let's say, I don't know, you like lasagna, nice big deep dish of lasagna. That's good college student food, right? So let's say you like the lasagna, but you'd say, well, wait a minute, but the lasagna, collectively is so much more than just the noodles, cheese, and sauce. And when you mingle all of these senses together, it can be seen maybe most clearly in example, as to what the outcomes are. Mingling all this stuff together, a multimodal perception, not just tearing it down to its individual parts. And like I say, all of those channels, or imagine all those apps running at the same time. there's what is called this McGurk effect, where a person's visual sensation influences the actual sounds they hear. So I'd say, like, go to YouTube, and there's maybe like a 30-second or 50-second, something, but it's less than a minute video that I popped up that just comes up right away about McGurk effect, and it's just basically an example of that. In other words, it's a case where all your senses, so you're watching something, so it's visual, and you're watching a person who's going to pronounce, so you're kind of focused on their mouth and watching the shape of their mouth as they pronounce the letters V, D, and B. Now, when I'm saying those, because you're not watching me say those, so you can distinguish. But if you watch this little short video, I'm sorry I can't pop it up. I probably could, but it would just take a little bit of effort. Sorry. But if you watch, then the person's going to be saying like V, or he's actually pronouncing something. But in so doing, you listen to him say that for like, okay, I got that. Then you listen to it, I got that. But then when he does all three at the same time, you really cannot distinguish the basic sound based on what you're seeing in terms of the movement of the mouth. And so it's just an interesting example of how this multimodal sensory kind of perception works. There's a lot of stuff going on when it comes to perceiving things. So we need to, jump in here and look a little bit at least the first part of this PowerPoint and see what we can get from it. So once again, our basic concepts. That's what we're working on now. So I'll let you stare at this for just a moment, and while you're doing that, and listening to me talk is a distraction. While you're looking at that, you see on top, sensation versus perception. That's ultimately what we're looking at, basic concepts regarding sensation versus perception. So you have to ask yourself, what do you see? So let's just think about sensation and perception. It's been a little bit before I distinguish between the two. But with sensation, we have the biological aspects of processing information that's received through the senses. Senses, sensation, right? So we're saying, how is it that I get this data? How is it that I get this information? Not thinking about information like words on a page, but what can I know? How can I appraise the environment around me? What kind of signals am I getting? I get those through the senses, hence sensation. What about perception? Well, now, based on what I'm getting from the channels, as they're all checking in, the hearing, the seeing, the taste, the smell, warm or cold on my body, all those types of things. How do I process that? What does that all mean in essence? What do I perceive from all of this? So what do you perceive from the images on the slide before you as you're seeing this? So I don't know, maybe you see first some hero in a burning building, so you've got this Batman figure, right, as it looks like over there to the left. If you're processing it this way, like if you're seeing it and you're saying, oh yeah, okay, so it looks like there's a bunch of flames, like something's on fire, and then there's this superhero character that comes to the rescue. Maybe you see that. Or maybe you see the face of a villain. If you turn this up the other way, or if you see it from the top down, like in the very center at the bottom, it looks like a nose, and then a mouth to the left of that, and further a chin, and further to the right, and it's just what it might look like. So let's say you have all four of you looking at this at the same time. Sensation is identical. and I say identical, but meaning if you're receiving this through the channel of sight, you're all seeing the same thing. You're not looking at it from, maybe from slightly different angles or something, but not as you're watching the video. It's right there in front of you, just like this. So you have to think about this. You have to say, well, wait a minute. So I'm seeing it the same. So why is it that it's perceived differently? Maybe it's not. Maybe it's not at all perceived. So it'd be interesting in the class if we were all together and you said, oh, okay, two of you see one, two of you see the other, three of you see one of you see the other, all four of you see something altogether different. I have no idea what that means, but it's easy then to illustrate even from this the difference between sensation. So we're all sensing something, but we could be perceiving it differently. So maybe take a step back and think about music, something more auditory. Think about music and think about bands, right? So think about maybe your parents or maybe your grandparents, somebody my age or a little bit older, but let's just say much older. I can't be that old. So think about bands and music and taste in music. Even within your own generation, you have different preferences, right? Different preferences for, it could be the same genre of music, but you prefer this group over that group, something like that. But yet, you all listen equally. In other words, you have the same sensory type of way to evaluate. You're all hearing the same thing. You're hearing these sound waves. You're all hearing it. And yet, how do you explain how one would perceive different? I realize we're talking preference here, musical preference, but musical preference is a form of perception. I perceive that I like that. I perceive that I don't like that. So the same auditory stimulus, but a different perception. There may be music that your parents like, that they perceive is enjoyable to them, and you're thinking, oh, it's horrible, I don't like it, and vice versa. You've heard the expression, perception is reality, right? So try to understand maybe that expression, perception is reality, in terms of what you're even learning from this simple presentation. Difference between sensation and perception, given the fact that people can sense the same, have the same sensory stimuli, but then have a different take on it, if you will, right? Different take on it, different preference either for or against it. Now, let's go on to something else. So this is kind of a 4-click ordeal here, and we're looking at signal detection. Like what's that? Well, we kind of step back into the research component, like of our previous lectures then. So here's a matrix up in front of you. You see colors, you see a matrix, meaning these 4 quadrants that could represent 4 outcomes. Okay, so signal detection at the top, the response given, yes or no, that's simple, and this signal presented, yes or no. It sounds like somebody's going to send a signal, and then the respondent, sounds like an experiment, right, or test. Someone is sending a signal, and the other is receiving it, and then is going to respond accordingly in at least 4 different ways. In our little sample group, we have these research participants, or what we call a subject, that is capable of detecting a signal in a sensory modality. Ooh, that's clever. A sensory modality. So a modality would be either sight or sound, taste, smell, something like that. Those are the individual modalities, and so it would just depend on the type of signal that is given in this case. So a signal is presented or a signal is not presented in this case. A participant either indicates they detected the signal or the participant indicates that they didn't detect it. Something like that. Okay. Now, I'm not sure you've ever experienced one of these, but like a hearing test, like some people have hearing tests. If you think there's something wrong with your hearing, it doesn't necessarily mean an age thing, but there can be all kinds of reasons why somebody might experience hearing loss. So when you say, let's say you go to like an audiologist and they're going to put, I don't really know, it's been so long, how they do this today, but they're going to put, let's say, some headset on you, and then they're going to provide the stimulus. They're going to send the signal out. They're going to send some sound at a particular pitch, and you're going to hold I can remember this from grade school. I think it was mandatory you had to have these hearing tests. And so you held your hand up, if you heard this or something like this. But that's a hearing test, and maybe you'd be familiar with that. So you look at these 4 different types of ways to respond. And so a signal, let's say a signal is presented and the participants give a response. So if you look, that's a yes, and you see the hit. Okay, so it's okay, fine. We connected, all things good, signal sent, signal respond. But then we go to the next box and we put miss in there. So there's a signal that's presented and the participant does not give a response. So there it is. Now that might indicate something's wrong, right? Either that or they're asleep or not paying attention, but it really doesn't matter. They didn't respond. Put a hash mark in that category. But then a signal, another one, false alarm. A signal is presented and the participant gives a signal is not presented, we should say. And the participant gives a response. So no sound went out. And that's going to tell you something else as a research specialist. It's going to tell you, maybe something's wrong. They don't want you to know that it's wrong, so they're trying to anticipate, and they take a shot in the dark. And so the last one, one would be a false alarm, and kind of the opposite of a false alarm would be a correct rejection. In other words, a signal is not presented, but you have no response whatsoever on the part of the respondent, and that's what you expect. So let's just hold for just a moment here and think about answering this simple question. What kind of information can we get from signal detection? That's fine, 4 clicks, 4 quadrants, and we get the idea of the research experiment. But what kind of, how do we break this down into further chunks so that we can understand the significance of this type of thing? So I think signal detection allows us to assess at least three things. So we should introduce this into the discussion, although it's a one-way discussion, right? One would be absolute threshold. We should know what that is. What's absolute threshold? What is differential threshold? And then what is sensory adaptation? So what were those again? We're talking about signal detection. Outside of 4 clicks, we're saying, what does this mean? What can we assess? We can we can assess things like absolute threshold, differential threshold, and then the effects on sensory adaptation. So let me just talk about absolute threshold for a second. Absolute threshold, so I'll explain these, kind of define them a little bit, and then give some examples, and it'll be jasne, we say in Polish, it'll be bright, it'll be clear. All right, absolute threshold, the smallest stimulus that can be detected when, for example, you conduct experimental research in particular. What's the smallest stimulus? Could be the smallest amount of sound, the smallest amount of taste, the smallest amount of sight, smell, so on and so forth. So maybe one example would be like, what if I'm remembering some old stereo system now. You know, used to have these things, be so impressed with the volume you could get out of these things. But it's got this dial on it that you can adjust the volume. But what is the lowest possible volume that you can detect? In other words, let's say the volume ran from 0 to 100, and of course you don't want it at 100, you know, but let's say you had it at 20, and then a friend of yours starts clicking it down, or maybe you just do it. Click, click, down, 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 down. How far can this go down? You hit 0, and of course nothing comes out, but still, what is the smallest amount of volume you can detect? That would be the absolute threshold. Now, if you didn't know that, you might think absolute threshold would be the loudest, but no, it's the lowest possible volume. Here's a few other examples as they relate to particular sensory channels, let's say like vision. Let's take a small candle. How far away can that candle be and still be visible to you? Could you see a candle flame 30 miles away? You know, that would then again be the lowest, it might be the highest possible distance, but what would happen at that distance? That candle would be the smallest. It'd be like, so in essence, you're thinking it's so far away, but really what you're saying is how small can that candle be and I can still see it? Again, this is absolute threshold. We'll try to park that in our brain right here. What about hearing? So now, as a kid, I can remember my grandfather gave me a pocket watch. I carried it with me everywhere, wound it every day, all that kind of thing. You'd have to get used to that thing at night because it'd just be tick, 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 tick. You know, if you're a light sleeper, you wouldn't be able to sleep. So this would be like a watch ticking 20 feet away. So again, it's not about the distance that it is away, but rather it's about how small of a sound can that make and you still hear it. How about smell? Yeah, how about smell? Maybe one of your dorm rooms or something. Ooh, that would be interesting. Let's change to like a drop of perfume. A drop of perfume in a 6-room house, or maybe just, you know, you think of a drop of perfume right in front of you, or a drop of perfume in the dining hall or something, or the gym, some large building. So it's like how small of an amount can be present where you can detect. How small of an amount can you detect that? Can your sense of smell detect that? Or taste, like, okay, so you take a teaspoon of sugar and just eat it. No, well, don't. But let's just say you do that. And okay, but what's the absolute threshold? Would be, how could I put that in a gallon of water and still detect it? Yeah, maybe. Could you put it in a 5-gallon container and still detect it? So that's the idea of absolute threshold. So we beat on that one pretty good. Again, signal detection, absolute threshold. What about what's called differential threshold? Or again, to repeat what I said earlier, JND, what's commonly called just noticeably different. Something like that, right? JND. So we're talking about the difference then being the minimum amount that something needs to change in order for a person to know the difference. And we're talking about two things here, right? Really, we're talking about observing two sensory stimuli. Two things are being sensed, and you know, basically, something needs to change in order for a person to know the difference. And this is what's measured in a differential threshold. So what might be an example of that? Okay, so something. So you say, at what point do you detect that something has changed in that stimuli? So one thing would be to close your eyes, but don't do that right now because it's just an example. Close your eyes, and I have to say, hey, hold your hand out, and then I put in your hand this amount of sand, something like that. I just scoop some up, put it in your hand, and you kind of cupped. Maybe let's just give you two hands so we can give a little bit more sand to you. And I threw that in there, and then I start adding more sand, but only just kind of like sprinkling it like that. Just little grains of sand. And this would have to go on for a while, and you've got your eyes closed, and what I want you to do is just sort of tell me, okay, it's different. Something's different now. I just sense something's different. That would be an interesting experiment. But that's the idea. It's like, when do you detect this something? Now if you're visually had your eyes open, visually, and you're looking at it, you'd sense immediately. But visually, let's say you're looking at, I had like a stack of 5 marshmallows, and then I added one more. Well, it might be even more obvious to you. But whatever that is, obvious or not, the differential threshold is the difference then between that's detectable. But it's the least amount of difference. It's like when you first detect, at that point when you first detect that something is different. And so this all relates to signal detection and research and experimentation. What about sensory adaptation? I mean, you get this. We go through it, every year in the Northeast. When our seasons change, and you know how that is. Like after a hot summer, earlier in the summer, 70 degrees is like, when's it going to warm up? When are we going to get summer? But then if we get 70 in October, we're thinking we call it, some type of late summer, Indian summer, something like that. So we always called it. It's because you've adapted somehow, sensory adaptation. In other words, there is a reduction in sensitivity to a stimulus after constant exposure to it. And there are numerous examples of this, but think of it this way: reduction in sensitivity to a stimulus after constant exposure to it. Okay, here's a scenario. So you're walking into a friend's house, apartment, something like that. You've been invited over for a meal of fried fish, sauerkraut, and some kind of pungent cheese. This is all prepared for dinner for you. Maybe you turn around and walk out. But you're wondering, when that just hits you in the face, all those food odors, you're wondering, how do these people survive cooking this stuff and preparing this stuff? And here they've been in there a long time. It's the same thing, with smokers and non-smokers. And I can remember years ago, it was just common. You worked in this place and it's filled with smoke. And this is when we're realizing how much secondary smoke that we're getting. But still, after a while, you don't notice it. And it's the same way today with smokers and non-smokers. The smokers, they really can't detect it on their clothes or anything, but you can. Maybe it's something like burning wood. We burned wood to heat our home, some years ago, and you just wouldn't realize the odor, that was on you. I kind of like the wood odor, but not everybody did. How about going into a dark room? Or outside at night, something like this, and your eyes eventually adjust to the darkness. They just do, and so on. You jump into a cold swimming pool or a cold lake, and you also adjust. So that's sensory adaptation. So we made a lot out of this slide. Signal detection, absolute threshold, threshold sensory adaptation. Okay, so one last thing, and then we'll finish up this round. Sensation perception, that's what we're looking at, big overview of it. You see there before you this blue triangle with some English words on it. So what we want to look at here is the difference between bottom-up and top-down processing. Okay, bottom-up and top-down processing. So sensation perception, we see these arrows, kind of extended in between those two underlined words that show there's some relation then between the two. So you as an individual, because I assume you're not all watching this together, but you as an individual then go ahead and read, just read what is written in the triangle out loud. And I would say that you probably read it in some coherent fashion. In other words, you probably read it as though it was a recognizable sentence. Now, here's something I want you to be brutally honest when you read that. Did you read that, I love Paris in the springtime? Is that how you read it? I love Paris in the springtime? I mean, be honest, is that how you read it? Maybe, and I'm saying out loud. I mean, if you did, you'd be like a whole bunch of people who missed the additional definite article, the additional the in the sentence. Do you see it? I love Paris in the springtime. So I don't know, when you read that, were you really concerned with processing every word separately? Or is that what we do, do we process every word separately when we read sentences? Or we read with the expectation of what we kind of know is there? Because we know the grammar so well, we just know what's coming. Like, for example, if we know the sentence structure, I love Paris in the springtime, is correct, we're not expecting a second definite article. So by means of cognition, or what we know about grammar, boom, there it is. We just say it in a grammatically correct way. So what's our goal here? We want to make a distinction between bottom up and top down processing. So when we read something, we have an expectation of what we'll see because of our knowledge of grammar. Now that would be top down. So let me just take a step back and sort of describe bottom up and top down, because I keep using these terms. So bottom up processing would be like you perceive something based on the sensory information that's coming into you. And again, this bottom up is the most simplistic. You're going to perceive with the least little bit of information. So it's like building blocks of perception, where perception is built on the smallest pieces of information. Maybe an example of that is you're sitting there and somebody wants to show you a bunch of photos, and they just throw a random photo, maybe a random photo of an eagle in front of you, and you immediately just recognize that. Not so much in a cognitive way, based on a whole bunch of other information, but it's just with that simple little bit of visual stimulus, you were able to perceive that. Okay, what's top-down processing then? That's perception that's driven by cognition. That is, your brain applies what it knows, assuming there's something in there. I know there's something in there, but your brain applies what it knows and what it expects, and then kind of fills in the blanks. Does that make sense? It's like, so you have all this previous experience, this previous knowledge, and understanding about things, and so grammar would be one of them, right? You know how to speak properly. You may not understand all the rules of grammar, but you've read enough to have learned it by repetition. Now, that kind of expectation drives perception. You know, it drives what we actually perceive through top-down processing. And you could probably, evaluate this, like, wow, that could be a good thing, or it could be a bad thing in terms of making false assumptions and all these types of things. Just like we didn't see the other definite article, the other "the" in there, so we missed something. What do we miss a lot of times when we do top down? Well, we could think of some real world examples. Let's just go back to this child, like, for example, learning how to read. A child learning how to read, they are relying primarily on bottom up processing. They don't have a lot of the cognitive stuff. They haven't had any extensive experience in reading. But what's an example? Can you go all the way back to those early readers? Well, let's say before the readers. So you'd have a picture of a cat, and then next to it is this. It would be one side of the page. Here's a picture of the cat. Other side of the page, it's spelled C-A-T, cat. And so your teacher would. You'd learn, by first the bottom up. Because you know what a cat is. You've heard people refer to cat, whether or not you can read the actual word or not. It's only until the picture was covered up that you started doing top down. But until then, you're doing bottom up. If that makes any kind of sense at all. Okay, so I think we got some basic understanding of sensation and perception, and we'll continue this next time.